Hi, and in this discussion vlog I'm going to talk about two things that might appear separate at first glance but are intrinsically linked in my mind. That is, incentivizing people to not abandon incomplete progress in a raid when the new one comes out, and also the ability to judge the worth of potential upgrades in gear. So a little bit of background on this one. During the early period of WoD, Blackrock Foundry came out at a time when only a few hundred guilds had killed Imperator Margok on Mythic mode. However, as the early fights in Blackrock Foundry were easier and rewarded better gear, including some tier, then Imperator was abandoned. There were guilds progressing on Mythic Margok in January who didn't bother to go back and finish it off until May. Now, I think we can all agree that this isn't a situation that is in anyone's interest. As Legion launched, I noted that there would be a greater gap between the equivalent raids in Legion, which will certainly help. As it has recently turned out, there's also a double whammy effect in that, all things considered, Emerald Nightmare is a lot quicker to progress through than Highmull was. The upshot of all this is that many more guilds will have completed Emerald Nightmare progress before even Trials of Valor comes out, never mind Nighthold. However, there will still be guilds progressing on Cenarius or Xavius when the new raid comes out, and they may choose, as in WoD, to abandon that progress as not being an efficient use of raid time. So Blizzard want to make sure that people still see that progress as important, even if it's alongside progress in the new raid. So before we look ahead to how this is supposed to happen in Legion, let's go right back to Vanilla. Here you didn't move smartly from one raid to another. It's quite hard to say for certain exactly what was common and what wasn't, as relatively few raiders contributed to the general forum noise that we get today. We can only really go off our own experiences at the time. And in my experience, guilds would continue with Ragnaros progress even when Blackwing Lair was available. The same thing was true if you hadn't killed Nefarian yet, but Anchorage had been opened, and so on. So what compelled people to carry on with the very tough boss at the end of one raid when the next one was available? Well, the main difference is the crossover of gear strength. There was no item level at the time, but you could still see the relative strength of items. We do now have item level, of course, and so it's easy to see what I'm going to talk about here. So this is an example of a weapon that drops off Ragnaros, just a normal epic version, not the item that upgrades a hammer to legendary. Now compare with the first boss in Blackwing Lair. The Ragnaros weapon is higher item level. We can see the same thing comparing a piece of gear off Nefarian, the last boss in Blackwing Lair, with Prophet Skerem, which is the first boss of Anchorage the following raid. If I were to look up some items on Wowhead, because I can't do this in the Dungeon Journal, I would see the same thing comparing an item that drops off Cthulhu, the final boss in Anchorage, with one of the first bosses in the old Naxxramas, which of course doesn't exist anymore. The fact that there was this crossover meant there was good upgrades to be had from completing and farming the previous raid tier. In fact, in the case of the transition between Tier 1 and Tier 2, two of the tier armor pieces dropped from Tier 1 bosses. Ragnaros and Onyxia both dropped Tier 2 items, even though they were Tier 1 bosses. This meant you would keep killing those to pursue your set bonuses regardless of anything else. In Burning Crusade it wasn't quite the same. It's certainly true that people carried on with Karazhan once they could do the Tier 5 raids, but that was often because people really enjoyed it and it was easy to get a casual group going as, well, it was 10 man, when the main raid size was 25. It was far less common to see people repeat Gruul and Magtheridon for long once you were progressing in Serpent Shrine Caverns and Tempest Keep. There was some crossover, but not a lot. When it came to the end of Tier 5, however, there were a lot of guilds who farmed Kel'Thas a couple more times to get everyone attuned for Mount Hyjal and then Black Temple, and then they pretty much never went back. This wasn't always the case. The gear from some Tier 5 bosses was still good, but lots of guilds simply wanted to rush headlong into the new raids, and there were enough early bosses in both to dissuade them from wanting to spend raid time farming the previous tier, much as it is now. So fast forward to the way raids have gone in the past few expansions, and you really do get to a point where you're stopping raiding a tier as soon as the next one is out, even if you'd only just completed it, or even if you hadn't completed it at all. The step up in quality of gear between the first bosses in one tier and the final and more difficult bosses of the previous tier is no encouragement to finish off that previous raid. So during a Q&A at one of the conventions attended by Blizzard just prior to the release of Legion, there was a stated desire to keep people interested in a raid even when the next one had been released. The jump forward mechanic first introduced in Blackrock Foundry will help with this because you don't have to spend time clearing all of the bosses in Emerald Nightmare if you just want to keep pushing Sonoris or Xavius when Trials of Valor or Nighthold come around. But time spent progressing could still amount to much more than time spent clearing, so this will do no more than alleviate some issues. Blizzard mentioned that they believe people will carry on doing the previous raid for a while because it gives access to more chances of high item level gear. It sounds similar to how I described it in vanilla. For example, there is a chance you could get a higher item level from Xavius than from, say, the first bosses in Nighthold. Well, that's if it Titan Forges and you're comparing it with the standard drops from Nighthold. However, the chances are not high, and it remains to be seen if this will keep people interested in actually progressing Emerald Nightmare when the 7.1 raids open. This is surely more important than simply having people carry on farming an already completed raid. At this point, it is worth mentioning that during Mists of Pandaria, the expansion before Warlords of Draenor, there was a time halfway through when Blizzard said they were going to do something to incentivize people doing 25-man raiding. This was at a time when you could do all difficulties of raiding on 10-man or 25-man. What it turned out to be was something called Thunderforge, which has since become Warforged and is now in a massively more expanded form, Titanforged. The idea that you could get an item that would just randomly upgrade by, at the time, 6 item levels, I believe it was. This was, as I say, supposed to incentivize more people to do 25-man. The reason was they were going to have the Thunderforge have a higher chance of occurring in 25-man. Was there a massive exodus of people from 10-man raiding to 25-man? No. And then you think, well, what was the reason for this? We can now see, now that Warlords of Draenor has been and gone, that in all likelihood, at around about that time was when they were probably making the decision, or had already made the decision, that in Warlords of Draenor there would be no 10 and 25-man raiding, that in actual fact it's all going to be condensed into a single raid size. Whether they decided what that raid size at that point was, who knows. Maybe they were hoping that it could be 25-man, but then because they didn't get a load of people changing from 10 to 25, they stuck it at 20 as a halfway house. Maybe what they wanted to do was to get people to create larger guilds, larger raid rosters, so that it wouldn't be too much of a bind for 10-man guilds to switch to 20-man. Who knows? But what I'm saying is, there have been times in the past when they have tried to, what you might call, socially engineer certain types of behaviour with rewards, and it hasn't always worked, and this is another one that I just don't think is going to work. Then we have the concept of item level itself, which is sort of the second thing I want to talk about here. Now, this may help or hinder the argument, really. Another statement from Blizzard regarding Legion was that they wanted people to be able to tell very simply whether one piece of gear was an upgrade or not. Well, if this really was a design aim of Legion, then surely it's in tatters. I have never seen so many questions on forums on whether a particular piece is an upgrade or not. And remember that, as Blizzard are keen to keep reminding us, the people who use forums are the better informed minority of players. How much more confusing for the 80% of more casual players. They said that they want people to be guided by item level. However, item level has never been a more useless guide of an upgrade. I am currently in possession of a good legendary ring. Been very lucky there, so that's one of my ring slots. But for the other, I have access to an item level 880 ring, an 870, an 875 with a socket. Am I using any of those? No. What I'm actually using is a level 850 ring. This is because the mastery stat on all those higher level rings is way behind for my particular spec. It's not that mastery is bad, it's just nowhere near as good as any of the others. So the overall benefit is to drop 30 item levels. In fact, there are some people who get a legendary ring or neck in particular and don't even wear it because it's just not an upgrade, even though it's 40 item levels higher than what they were using. It's more of a problem with rings and necks, of course, because they have no primary stat. It's less likely to be the case with armour because your primary stat of strength, intellect or agility is usually your strongest one for output, though that is not always the case. But then the inevitable follow-up question is, why were primary stats removed from some pieces of gear, when this would very obviously act against the stated intention of letting item level inform upgrade decisions? This is not to say that item level works for other pieces, however. Even armour, which always includes primary stats, is not always an upgrade just because the item level is. We also have the random socket appearing on gear, which was started in WoD, which also acts against this. So now the vast majority of players are completely confused by whether or not one piece of gear is an upgrade over another. The only way to possibly work it out is by knowing your stat weights and using an add-on such as Pawn, which I've done videos on, but neither of those things is an integral part of the game provided by Blizzard. In addition, stat weights are yet another bone of contention because we really need to get the message out there that there isn't a set of stat weights that applies to a spec. They are personal to individual players and change all the time. In addition, they can vary quite a lot when changing talents or for different fights. Then we come to trinkets. For quite a while now, trinkets have been a bit tricky because they are phenomenally powerful pieces, but have a variety of procs or on-use effects which are not directly comparable. The only way to properly judge trinkets is to have them accurately modelled and simulated. In the past, the senior theorycrafters would do exactly this and then provide a batch list showing the results. However, there are rather more difficulties in Legion. For a start, it's taken a while to get them accurately modelled in the first place because the items were not easily available for testing during the beta. Just as with specs, it's also quite common for the developers to keep tuning trinkets after they have been obtained live, which can change things quite a bit, and there will be a delay between the change and the simulation model being updated. Finally, the Titan Forge throws everything out of whack here. I'm preparing a video guide on trinkets for Retribution Paladin specifically at the moment, and keeping it simple is anything but simple itself. I forget now who said they wanted players to easily see whether a piece was an upgrade by using item level as a guide, but I'm fairly sure they were not in agreement with the rest of the development team. All things considered, I would argue that it has never been more difficult to decide whether one piece of gear is an upgrade on another without some preparation. In fact, going back to that mention I made of an 875 item level ring with a socket, when I actually got it in a Mythic Plus dungeon, there was a warrior in the raid for whom it was a very large upgrade, but I was not able to trade it to them because at the time it was the highest item level ring I had, and you can only trade personal loot if you already have an equal or higher item level item for the same slot. The game thinks, and the game certainly behaves, as if item level is king, when it's very far from that. So my summary on the twin issues here is that I'm far from convinced that people will carry on with the progress in one raid when the new one comes out, and that the confusion of gear upgrades will become so deafening that there will surely have to be a rethink for the following expansion. When you can turn down an item 20 item levels higher, even with primary stats, because it's a downgrade, then the item level becomes a worse than useless indicator. And when the initial and easier bosses of a new raid drop reliably better gear than the final and more difficult bosses of a previous raid, then people will abandon progress to pursue the new content. I'm not seeing anything fundamentally cunning in Legion to persuade me otherwise, but of course, as with all things, time will tell. So there we are. As always, I hope you found this interesting. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share, and until next time, I'll see you later.